Hello everyone, and welcome to week 5, where we're going to continue talking about Mintz's sweetness and power, and we're going to shift to also discussing Harper's changing works. More to come on that in a coming video. Before we get there though, I just wanted to say thank you to everyone who's been sending me pictures, enthusiastic pictures in many cases, of your little baby plants. I got a couple over the weekend, even without asking for them, where you sent me a picture and said, hey, look at my plant growing, and that was like such a great thing to see. So anytime you want to send me an update, whether I asked for one or not, feel free to send me a pic. I really love to see them, and I hope you keep enjoying the miracle of growing food. It's pretty amazing when you plant a seed in a patch of dirt and all of a sudden you see, whoop, it comes up as a sprout and starts growing. It's really exciting to see that, and it kind of brings out, I don't know, this sense of wonder in nature and the way that things can just grow out of the ground like that. It's pretty cool to see firsthand. I think in particular sunflowers, a lot of you have been sending me your sunflower pics. The basil is a little bit slower to grow, but the sunflowers are really popping out and quickly in a lot of cases. And if you look back at the video that I did over the summer that I sent to you before everyone came to campus, I gave you a little tour of my garden, and it included a view of some sunflowers that I was growing at that time. I'd put some seeds just like the ones that you planted in your cups in my garden. So you can see, I know it's kind of blurry, but those are some sunflower plants that are featured in this video from July 30th. And then on September 12th, about a month and a half later, these are the same plants. They're about 7-8 feet tall, way taller than me, and have flowers coming out. Unfortunately, they got zapped in the frost that we had a couple weekends ago, so they're not there anymore. I had to cut them down, but while they were there, they were pretty glorious. And again, they grew feet over the course of a month and a half, several feet, and were really beautiful looking plants with nice looking flowers. So sunflowers do sprout up quickly, and they really are fast growers. And even if you put them in pots, like you can see these that I have on my deck at home in a couple pots, those taller plants there, the kind of skinny, spindly tall ones, are sunflowers, the same exact seeds. Again, you can kind of see how they grow up, and they've got the seed leaves here down at the bottom that are kind of a little wilty, but on the top there are leaves growing up in the second, third, fourth leaf growings. And this one, I'll have to see if I can take a more recent picture. The one on the right actually looks like it's going to start blooming into a flower before too long if the weather holds and it doesn't get zapped by frost. They're a little higher up on my deck there, so I think that they were able to handle that frost. We got a little bit better. Anyway, that's all to say, keep enjoying the growth of your seedlings, and keep sending me those pictures. I hope you really enjoy that process. So the reading that we have for Mintz this week, we're continuing on from the production discussion that we had last week to really talking about consumption and power, the chapters 3 and 4 that he has in sweetness and power. We really want to understand how, as sugar became more and more prevalent, especially in English society and across different class levels, it really kind of had a really strong impact on the culture, the politics, the economics of sugar in that time period, and helps us, again, as we've kind of said many times along the way, really kind of understand better where we are today by understanding where sugar came from and how it got to be so influential and so central in people's lives. And overall, a big part of that process was the commodification of sugar, turning sugar into an actual commodity. That's kind of, again, one of those words that we have kind of a sense of. We might use it in everyday life kind of colloquially, but it has kind of a more technical meaning as well. Commodification means to take something and turn it into a product that's standardized and that we can use across markets. So to kind of give a little bit more detail on that, standardization and interchangeability is a really important part of commodification, making things the same. And so sugar, if you think about now when you see table sugar, like you get one of those little packets that's at a coffee shop, or even the raw sugar, the brown stuff that's supposed to look kind of more natural and not quite as refined as white sugar, it's pretty standardized. It's pretty same. You wouldn't expect to see giant crystals in one pack and little crystals in another, or different shades and so forth. It is a standardized piece of food that you can have, a food item, and you don't really expect much change from item to item, day to day, year to year. It has that sameness that allows it to be considered more or less equal across place, across time, and so forth, so that when consumers buy it, say food processors and so forth, they can kind of treat it all the same. And a lot of other food items are like this now. Corn is a good example. There's different grades of it. And same things with meats. You know, go to the grocery store and you can see like different grades of meat or grades of eggs, right? But across those grades and those standards, they're supposed to be more or less the same so that we can treat them equally. And we kind of know what we're getting. And that if we wanted to make them into some kind of product, we would know what we need and what grade and approximately what it would cost from day to day, year to year, depending on how those markets work. It also allows us to routinize practices and kind of do them the same. So even something as simple as baking some cookies and it calls for a cup of sugar. Well, a cup of sugar, white sugar, is going to be different than a cup of raw sugar because of the density or how fine or coarse the grains of sugar are, right? Same thing with salt. If you use kosher salt versus table salt, you know that you have to adjust your volumes a little bit. But across table salt or across table sugar, we assume that it's more or less the same, and it allows us to do things like bake a batch of cookies, or on a larger scale to have a food system where we can use those things interchangeably and have a standardized set of items as well as the practices that we use to process and consume them. It also allows us to have exchange across these national or even global markets. So commodification also means that we can actually send things around the world, and when it gets there, people know what they're getting if they get a certain grade of corn or a certain type of egg. Not that we ship eggs around the world that much. They're a little bit more regional because they're perishable. But especially for things that can be shipped, like grains, sugar, coffee is a good one. There's specific grades that allow for that global trade to happen. And in fact, you can actually go onto commodities markets and you can see that there's set prices for the futures of certain commodities. You can kind of buy and trade them just like you would stocks. If you're buying stock in Nestle or in Monsanto or another company that has a lot to do with food and the processing of food and distribution of food, you can buy futures for hogs or corn or sugar, in fact. Don't believe me? Let's take a look and let's jump into a commodity market page. Okay, so here you see a web page that shows commodity prices from trading today. It starts off with things like metals and energy items, industrial metals, and then if we scroll down, we see agricultural commodities, food items. So things like cotton, oats, lumber, coffee is a big one of the major world commodities, right up there with oil. Down at the bottom, we've got sugar. We can see that sugar closed down a little over 3% today. And over the course of the last year, there's been some ups and downs with sugar prices, including at the onset of the pandemic in the US in April and May. You can see the price kind of crashed and has gone up a bit since then. But here's a good example then of a commodity item that you can buy and trade on the open market. So the consequence then is that farmers lose the control that they have over setting the price. Of course, there's always been negotiation over the price or the barter exchange that happens for food since people have been producing food and trading food. But in a commodity system where you have futures like that set the price, it's almost entirely out of a farmer's control unless they're a major producer and they have the capacity to really influence the market and the market price in that way. For the most part, those prices are out of the hands of out of the hands of producers. And it means that situations like where we had this drop in milk prices earlier this year and some producers had to dump their milk because the prices went so low, forces kind of seemingly strange responses to those shifting prices. So Sweetness and Power is a book about power, as it's in the title, and we have a chapter called Power that we read for class this week as well. So we can ask the question of what exactly sugar has to do with power. What are the power dynamics that we see there? And power is actually an interesting sociological or social science phenomenon in that we kind of think we know what power means. When we talk about it in everyday sense, if we say that somebody has a lot of power, we mean that they can influence things. They can influence other people. They have some way of pulling the strings or forcing other people or entities to do their bidding in that way. But power doesn't necessarily always have to be direct power. It can be embedded in institutions, in material settings, in a lot of different ways that are kind of behind the scenes that can be a part of power relations, where some people are more powerful than others, but not necessarily have that direct form of control, rather kind of more of an indirect form through influence, and even through things like cultural influence. And that's one of the things that we want to talk about. Maybe we can use things like the food diagram to help us see the ways that culture, politics, economics, and ecology are all part of this system of power around sugar. Earlier in the semester, I gave you an example from my own research where I did work in California on the fresh produce industry there, and I showed you this example of an ecology of power. One of the things we can ask about, is there a similar picture that we could make for Mintz's case and show the way in which power is reflected and embedded in these systems of exchange as sugar becomes more and more of a commodity, as it becomes a key part of celebrations and other parts of culture in people's everyday lives, and even today a part of our lives as well. How is sugar part of an ecology of power? We can think about that question and discuss that a little bit more in class. As a more specific way of asking this question, we can talk about the working class and the story that Mintz tells about how working class Englanders became more and more used to having sugar as part of their everyday diet, and the story that Mintz tells about how that created kind of a connection between labor in the colonies and labor in the colonial powers, and the way that the working class, as they start to eat more and more sugar and develop this market domestically, led to the growth of power for sugar producers and other people who had an interest in seeing that increased consumption. Mintz also uses the terms intensification and extensification to categorize the ways that sugar was important for 18th and 19th century Europeans. And those are terms that we want to define and talk about in class tomorrow. So I'm not going to go into too much detail here, but maybe say that you want to be familiar with those terms, be ready to define them in class, and then we can talk about the ways that intensified use of sugar and extensified use of sugar was part of this story about how the working class started to use it more and more broadly, and it became more a part of their diets and connected with those power relations that I was just mentioning. So just to follow up then on those questions, let's talk about in class who got powerful from sugar and how did they do it? What were some of the mechanisms and the connections that were happening there in terms of culture, in terms of politics, economics, and ecology? And following up on that, the food diagram, how can we use it to help illustrate those power dynamics? And last thing I asked you to think about is the role of sugar in your everyday life. I'd really like to start off class by talking about this, get some reflections, and then use that to jump into Mintz and discuss his chapters on consumption and power. We'll do that soon. I'll see you in class.